You're live.
Okay. Hi. Welcome to our, oops. Okay, sorry, we're having a little bit of a late start today due to some technical difficulties. We seem to be okay. Happy Monday. Welcome to today's AP Biology lesson. Today our lesson will be on new material in Unit 8. On Friday, April 3rd, an announcement was made providing details about the 2020 AP Biology exam. In case you're just hearing this, I'm going to give you some details about the exam. The 2020 exam will be administered on Monday, May 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All exams will be taken by students at home. The exam will consist of 2 free response questions. The first question is a long FRQ and will have a 25-minute time limit. The second question is a short FRQ and will have a 15-minute time limit. Beginning tomorrow, we will be presenting lessons that will review the first 6 units in the AP Biology course. All lessons, including these with new material, will include practice with science skills which are relevant with any content. We will also provide practice with free response questions in each lesson. A little bit more about the announcement that was made about the 2020 exam. This is a screenshot from AP Central. One thing I do want you to notice is that the time says 1 p.m., that's standard time, Central Standard Time, excuse me, but the primary date will be Monday, May 18th. If any students have conflicts with that date, there will be one makeup date, and that will be Wednesday, June 3rd. Again, this is posted, so there will be 2 questions for a total of 45 minutes of testing time. 25 minutes will be provided for the first question with 5 minutes to submit your answers, followed by a 15-minute short answer question, and then another 5 minutes to submit your question. At the bottom, it talks about these video reviews that we're doing, and tomorrow we'll begin our review sessions. They're the same time every day from 4 to 4:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The link is there, but if you're here, you've probably already found it. And as we get closer to exam date later on in April, there will be some guidance provided about how you're going to be able to submit your responses, and also there'll be some practice simulations so that you'll be ready to submit your answers on exam day. A little bit more information about the actual questions on the AP Biology exam. So again, question 1 is a long free response question, and it is going to be about interpreting and evaluating experimental results. And it will make up 65% of your total exam score. So on a normal testing year, we would tell you to spend about 20 to 22 minutes on a long FRQ. So you're getting a little bit more time, and then you're going to have 5 minutes to upload your response. What will happen in this question is you'll be given a scenario, and it'll be accompanied by data and a data table or graph. And you're going to be asked to do 4 different things. So here's where those task verbs that we've been working on come into play. You're going to be asked to describe and explain biological concepts, processes, or models. You're going to be asked to identify experimental design procedures. You are going to be asked to analyze data. And finally, you're going to be asked to make and justify predictions. And you can see how those points are distributed. The second question is a short FRQ. And again, if this was a testing year, I always tell my students to plan to spend about 6 minutes per short FRQ, and you have 15. So you have quite a bit of time there. So, read the question carefully and you look at those command terms or task verbs. This second question will make up 35% of your total exam score. So you'll be given a scenario that will describe a biological phenomenon with some type of a disruption. And you'll be asked to describe the biological concepts or processes. You'll be asked to explain biological concepts or processes, or describe characteristics that are represented visually. And the last time we were together, we looked at phylogenetic trees and cladograms, and those would be examples of concepts that are represented visually. You will also be asked to predict the causes or effects of a change in a biological system. That's that disruption, and then justify those predictions. And this is a 4-point short FRQ. So, hi, I'm Allison Kate. I'm affiliated with both UC Berkeley and Redwood High School, and today I'm teaching you from my home in El Cerrito, California. So let's do our warm-up. If you're just joining us, the warm-ups are AP exam practice questions that are given for homework from the previous lesson. So our last lesson was on Friday, and it was on topic 7.10, which I believe is speciation. My colleague, Ms. Pfizer from Florida, assigned this homework to you. So if you have it, bring it, get it out. If you don't have it, grab your pencil and paper and try to answer this as we move through this FRQ. So let's read the question together, and then we'll take a look at that visual representation of data, and then we'll look at our task verbs, what we were asked to do with this question. So in an attempt to rescue a small isolated population of snakes from decline, a few male snakes from several larger populations of the same species were introduced into the population in 1992. The snakes reproduce sexually, and there are abundant resources in the environment. The figure below shows the results of a study of the snake population both before and after the introduction of outside males. In the study, the numbers of captured snakes indicate overall population size. So you can see on the y-axis, the dependent variable is the number of snakes captured. And we also have a legend that tells us the total number of snakes captured are represented by the lighter bar, and the juvenile snakes captured are represented by the darker bar. On the y-axis, we have the year, the time, which is the independent variable. And we have an arrow that shows us when the males from the outside population were introduced, and that arrow is right here. So as we look at this, we can get a trend for both the total number of snakes captured and the juvenile snakes captured. So your task verbs, first in part A, are to describe one characteristic of the original population that may have led to the population's decline in size between 1989 and 1993. You see those bars get lower. And then propose one reason why the introduction of outside males rescued the snake population from decline. You can see after they were introduced, those bars begin to increase. And then in part C, describe how the data support the statement that there are abundant resources in the environment. So there are 3 tasks that you needed to address in this question. So let's take a look at the scoring guidelines. In part A, each of those bullet points for the description are worth 1 point. You don't need to say them all, but you do need to say one of those 4. So one way to say the description is that the population that may have, or the characteristic that may have led to the population's decline would be that it lacked genetic diversity or variation, or that it was aged, an old population, post-reproductive, there weren't enough young snakes. It could have had an unfavorable sex ratio with too few males, or the population could have had a harmful mutation or a disease. So any one of those points that describe the decline between 1989 and 1993 was worth 1 point. The second part, propose. One reason that the introduction of the outside males rescued the snake population. Again, any one of those bullet points would earn the point. So those new males could have increased the genetic diversity in the population. They could have increased reproductive success. They could have established a beneficial sex ratio or introduced resistance to disease that was affecting the original population. And then the last part asks you to describe how the data support the statement that there are abundant resources in the environment. And if you look at that graph, you can see that the population does increase in number. So you could say that the population can and does grow, or you could have said that if the resources were limited, the population would not grow. So this was a 3-point question. Each part, A, B, and C, was worth 1 point. So let's look at today's lesson. Don't forget your paper and pencil because we do want this to be interactive. So today we'll be introducing you to the concepts of community ecology and disruptions to ecosystems. And we're going to get some practice with Science Skill 5A, which is calculations of mathematical equations that are in the curriculum. We're going to look at the Simpsons diversity index equation, and we're going to look at both sample, multiple choice, and free response questions that combine these contents and skill. As we get started today, there are a few concepts that you should be familiar with: community ecology, ecosystems, and human impact on ecosystems. And then finally, the terms competition, predation, symbiosis, habitat, and invasive species would be important to have in mind. By the end of this lesson, the objectives are that you will be able to understand that communities and ecosystems change on the basis of interactions among populations and disruptions to the environment. And the overarching idea is that we'd like you to understand that evolution is characterized by a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time and is supported by multiple lines of evidence. And you might be thinking, well, that's an evolution objective, and we're talking about ecology. What we see today does provide evidence for that change in a genetic makeup of a population. So just to kind of pinpoint where we are in the overall AP Biology course, we're in Unit 8, which is about ecology. The units are broken down into smaller topics, and we're going to be looking at 2 topics today: 8.5, which is about community ecology, and 8.7, which is about disruptions to ecosystems. Each topic is broken down into learning objectives, or LOs. This is what students need to be able to do with the content knowledge. Today, we're going to be working on a couple of different LOs from each of these topics. So if you look at community ecology, we would like you to be able to explain how interactions within and among populations influence the community structure, to be able to describe the structure of a community according to its species composition and diversity, and to explain how community structure is related to energy availability in the environment. And then for disruptions to ecosystems, we'd like you to be able to explain how interactions between the environment and random or pre-existing variations in populations. We'd like you to be able to explain how invasive species affect the ecosystem dynamics. We'd like you to be able to describe how human activities lead to changes in the ecosystem structure and/or dynamics. And finally, we'd like you to be able to explain how both geological and meteorological activity leads to changes in the ecosystem structure and/or dynamics. The essential knowledge is the knowledge that is required to be able to perform the learning objective, and that will be my teaching part of today's lesson. So today our topic skill pair is community ecology along with mathematical calculations. So here's what you need to know. Okay, so we're going to start off with community ecology, and we want to know that the structure of a community is measured and described in terms of species diversity. This can be quantified, and we quantify it using something called the Simpsons diversity index, and it's a big scary equation. I'm going to walk you through it, so don't be scared. This formula can be found on the AP Biology formulas and equation sheet, and the Simpsons diversity index is 1 minus the sum of the total number of organisms of one particular species divided by the total number of organisms of all species, and all of that is squared. And I know that looks scary, but let me take you through an example because it's really not that scary. Okay, so first thing, and this should make you feel really good, students are not required to memorize the formula. It is in the formula sheet, but you do need to understand the meaning of each of the symbols. And you'll be happy to know that students will not have to do the calculations, but you do need to understand what the diversity value indicates about species richness. So if you go back to the first slide I shared with you, how we describe a community is based on the diversity of living things in that community. So let's take a look at the symbols. D is the diversity index. Capital N is the total number of organisms of all of the species found in that community. The weird looking Z-like thing is the Greek letter sigma, and it means the sum of. You may recall this from the chi-square formula. Lowercase n is the number of individuals of a particular species. So those are the parts of that equation. Since the diversity index D is a measure of species richness, a high value of D suggests a stable and established site. A low value of D could suggest pollution, which decreases the diversity, recent colonization, so there's not a lot of different organisms in that environment. Maybe it's undergoing succession, or there could be some type of human interaction with agricultural management. So let me give you an example. In my example, Lake Catay contains 934 brown trout, 733 smallmouth bass, 34 catfish, 2,003 carp, 243 steelhead trout, and 32 northern pike. And at this diversity index value was calculated. And I'm going to show you how I got that number to be 0.9 roughly. Okay, that's high. The closer to 1, the more diverse the community is. So this means that Lake Catay is a stable community since the diversity index value is high. So if you look at this data table, I've got all of the organisms listed in the first column. I've got the total number of organisms of each type, and at the bottom, I added all that up, and I got the total number of organisms, capital N, is 3,970. And then I just did some math. I took the number of species, in this example, it would be the brown trout, and I divided it by the total number of species, which was 3,970, and I squared that, and that's this value. And I did it for each of the types of fish in this community, in this lake, and I added it up. That's the sum of, and I got 0.055. Remembering that D is 1 minus the sum of those values, I simply subtracted that, and that's where that diversity value index number of 0.945 comes from. Again, the take-home lesson is that the higher that number, the closer to 1, the greater the diversity in that particular community. We'll practice more with this when we get to our guided practice section of this lesson. So let's talk about community ecology in terms of how organisms access energy and matter within a community. And I know you guys have studied this since you were middle school, maybe even elementary school science students. And what we're talking about here is this trophic structure or feeding structure of the community. Both food chains and food webs show the interactions. So let's first look at a food chain, which is just one path of the energy transfer. And remember, and this is a common misconception that students often have, the arrow is pointing to the eater. So that means that the energy is going toward that organism. So if we look at the food chain, we know that we start at the first trophic or feeding level, and this is with the primary producers. So these are plants or algae that are producing chemical energy from solar energy through the process of photosynthesis. The second trophic level are the primary consumers, and they feed directly or gain their energy directly from the primary producers. So they're the herbivores. The third feeding or trophic level are the secondary consumers. They're the carnivores, and they eat the herbivores. And then you can go on to a fourth or a fifth trophic level with tertiary and quaternary organisms feeding on the previous level. One thing I should point out is probably 5 trophic levels is maximum for any food chain. And I'm illustrating a terrestrial food chain, but please keep in mind that aquatic food chains could be an example as well. And one thing that I'm sure your teachers have taught you is something called the 10% rule. And what that means is only 10% of the energy that is derived from the previous trophic level is actual energy that goes to that organism. The other 90% of that energy goes to the business of doing life. Maybe it's lost in the process of respiration, or it's the energy to move or to find a mate, or it's lost as heat. So that in this example, the herbivore, which kind of looks like a grasshopper, will only get 10% of the energy that was produced by that plant. If you look at the food web, it shows all of the possible energy paths. And again, the arrow points toward the organism that is gaining the energy. And so if you look at the bunny is an herbivore. It eats the grass. It is going to be getting its energy from the grass. If you look at the top consumers in this food web, you can see there are two raptors. There's an owl and there's a hawk. And those guys can, let's look at the owl first. The owl can get its energy by eating the bunny. It can get it from eating the squirrel, the bird, or the rodent. So there are multiple ways that top consumer can get its energy. So now let's talk about some relationships among interacting populations in a community. We can characterize these as either positive interactions or negative interactions. And I've kind of classified them and use some shorthand. So let's start off with competition. Competition is illustrated by the shorthand of negative/negative, and that means that for the organisms that are involved in competition, neither of them benefit. Okay, the next kind of column is predation, parasitism, and herbivory. You can notice the shorthand has a plus sign / minus sign, and that means that one of the organisms in this association is going to benefit while the other is harmed. And I've showed you an image of parasitism in the lower left, and that poor larva does not look happy being parasitized. And then the other group's niche partitioning is plus plus shorthand, which means that all of the organisms benefit because there's no niche overlap. And so all of the organisms kind of get what they need in their own little environment there, microenvironment. Mutualism is a situation where both organisms benefit, and I'm showing you a picture in the middle image of ants and aphids that are both benefiting from this association. And then finally, there's commensalism, which the shorthand is plus/0, and that 0 means neither harmed nor benefited. And you can see the right side has an example of commensalism where there is a bird on the back of a cattle, and there are many species that have this type of relationship. The bird benefits because it picks off food from the cattle, and the cattle don't seem to being there. All right, so keep in mind both of the type of interaction and that shorthand. All right, two other key terms that I want to define for you because they're important in determining how these different populations access energy and matter in a population. So first of all, I have some images of some different organisms obtaining energy. So you can see in the left side, there's a bee. It is obtaining nectar from the flower. It in turn is pollinating that flower by moving pollen from flower to flower. So that's a mutualistic association. And you can see that that bear on the far right is eating the salmon, and that is predation. The bear is the predator, it's winning. The salmon, unfortunately, is the prey, and it is losing. So that would be a plus minus, whereas the bee and the flower example are plus plus. So the two terms I want to define for you are keystone species and dominant species, and a common misconception is to mix these up. So let's try to keep these straight. A keystone species is a species whose presence and role within an ecosystem has a disproportionate effect on the other organisms within the system. Can give you 3 examples. The American beaver is one example of a keystone species in North America, and you can see the image on the left shows the beaver, which alters its ecosystem by building dams, and it provides little habitats for other organisms in that community. In the middle image, you see the otter, and it is an important keystone species in the marine environment, and it balances the kelp population. So without that otter in there, the kelp population overgrows and disrupts that ecosystem balance. And then finally, on the right, we see an image of some wolves, and a wolf is a keystone species in certain ecosystems, and often the top predator is also a keystone species, which is the case of the wolf. So what's the difference between that and the dominant species? The dominant species is the species that is generally the most populous or comprises the greatest biomass in the ecosystem. It doesn't necessarily have the greatest impact on that particular ecosystem. It's just the most numerous. So let's talk about some disruptions to ecosystems. A term that I pointed out that you should be familiar with is invasive species. Invasive species are species that are often introduced by humans that take hold outside of its native range. And you probably know lots of examples of this in your own areas, but I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is the kudzu weed. It's an invasive plant species in the United States. And I know the first time I saw this, I was traveling, I was visiting some friends in the South, and we were driving on the highway, and this weed was everywhere. I'm like, what is that? And they were super surprised that I had never seen a kudzu weed. But its introduction has produced devastating environmental consequences. This has earned it the nickname of the vine that ate the South. And another example is a lionfish, and it threatens the well-being of coral reefs and other marine ecosystems, including the commercially and recreational important fishes that depend on them. So it's can impact humans' enjoyment, recreationally speaking, and then perhaps our food supply because the lionfish outcompetes those species. A little bit more about invasive species is they can outcompete native species, they can kill native plants and trees, destroy habitats, and overpredate the native species within a particular area, and that can throw the entire ecosystem out of balance. The image is just showing what's happening to a freshwater lake as this weed just infiltrates and blocks out the sunlight, so perhaps any other species is prevented from growing there. So one thing that kind of struck me is that these invasive species are considered a greater threat to native biodiversity than pollution, harvest, and disease combined. And they threaten that biodiversity by causing disease. They can act as predators or parasites. They can compete. They can alter the habitat, and they can hybridize with local species. So not just invasive species, but human populations can also impact the physical environment. So the way that we consume food, use energy, change the land, make pollution, these are all driving forces behind global ecosystem change. We do this in many ways, predominantly pollution, burning fossil fuels, and deforestation. And changes like these have triggered climate change, soil erosion, poor air quality, and undrinkable water. And I'm showing you an image at the bottom where a human is burning some forest land in what is called slash and burn agriculture, where they're burning down the forest to make way for planting crops or for raising cattle. So humans have converted forest to agricultural and urban uses, exploited species, and fragmented wildlands. This changes the demographic structure of forests. It alters habitats, degrades the environment with both atmospheric and soil pollutants, and introduces exotic pests and competitors. So I just want to point out that humans can have drastic consequences and disrupt ecosystems. There are also geological and meteorological events that affect habitat change and ecosystem distribution. Natural events like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, and floods can all be very powerful, and they can change both human and wildlife habitats. And they can change it in damaging ways, sometimes in helpful ways as well. But most often it is in a damaging manner. Climate change can alter where species live, how they interact, and the timing of biological events such as flowering, which can fundamentally transform the current ecosystems and food webs. Climate change can overwhelm the capacity of ecosystems to mitigate extreme events and disturbance such as wildfires, floods, and drought. And I live in California, and last year we had a very difficult fire season brought on by local drought. And finally, and you guys have probably all heard of this, that mountain and Arctic ecosystems and the species that live there are particularly sensitive to climate change. And I'm showing you a picture of polar bears because we know that the Arctic, the increase in climate is causing the icebergs to melt and disrupting the habitat for those polar bears. So some key takeaways that I hope you got from this discussion is that the availability of resources can result in uncontrolled population growth and ecological changes. The distribution of local and global ecosystems changes over time. Humans can impact the change at local and global levels and accelerate that. Introduction of new diseases can devastate native species. Habitat change can occur because of human activity, and both geological and meteorological events can affect habitat change. And there are plenty of studies that are called biogeographical studies that illustrate these changes. So let's take a look at some practice with multiple choice and free response. Let's get back to that diversity index, remembering that it gives us an idea of the diversity of that community. And I'm giving you two different communities, a meadow and an African park. And you can see the numbers of the individual trees in the meadow community and the given diversity index of value. And again, if you want to practice this, you could totally apply that formula after this broadcast is done. You can stop it here, get the data, and then practice the math if you are so inclined. But the diversity index is 0.59. When you look at the African park with its lions, giraffes, wildebeest, elephants, and hyenas, when you calculate its diversity index, it's 0.25. So a question that might come from this is to distinguish the diversity differences between these two different locations. And hopefully you remember that the larger the D value, the diversity index, the greater the species diversity in that particular ecosystem. So the meadow ecosystem has a greater diversity because its D value is 0.59 compared to the African park ecosystem with a D value of 0.25. So the take-home message is the higher the D value, the greater the diversity. Multiple choice practice. So let me read you the question and you read along with me. Researchers studied the diversity of macroscopic invertebrates in different areas of watershed ecosystems. They collected samples from 58 sites along 11 streams in the same geographical area. Their data were classified by stream type and can be found in Figure 1. The stream type classifications range from the perennial stream type, which always has water, to the intermittent stream type, which is dry for more than 9 months during the year. I want you to also notice that the diversity of these macroscopic invertebrates in different stream types has error bars that represent a 95% confidence interval, which means that there's plus or minus 2 standard error of the mean. So when you look at this, before we look at the question, if we look at the graph, we can see that the dependent variable is Simpson's diversity index, and we've got those values. Remember, the higher the value, the more diverse. And then on the y-axis, the x-axis, we have the independent variable, which are the type of streams, perennial, transitional, seasonal, and intermittent. And you can look at the height of the bars. I also want you to look at the error bars as well. This is going to be important in answering this question. So the question that you're asked is way down there at the bottom. You see that here. Which of the stream types has a statistically lower macroscopic invertebrate species diversity than the seasonal streams? Okay, so the question is which of the stream types, and it is statistically significant. So I want to call your attention. So if you look at the bars, right, you can see that the transitional and the intermittent have lower values than seasonal and perennial. If you look at the error bars on the transitional overlaps on the seasonal, right? Got that? It also overlaps on the perennial. So let's take a look at the intermittent. With its error bars, it does not overlap on the seasonal or the perennial. So hopefully that will help you with your answer choice. So let's take a look at the answer choice. You can look at A, being transitional streams only, B, intermittent streams only, C, perennial and intermittent streams only, D, transitional and intermittent streams only. Let's go back. Okay, so you can see the graph. Hopefully you got your answer. So here we go. Correct answer is B, intermittent streams only. And you might have gotten thrown off if you didn't look at those error bars and choose either C or D. Okay, so let's move on. All right, let's do a check for understanding by looking at a free response question. So this starts off with a graph, and the graph is titled The Variation in Population Density of Beetles. We can see our dependent variable is the population density measured in beetles per square meter. And we can see that the y-axis, I did that again, the x-axis or independent variable is the year. We can see a legend that shows 3 species. Species A is indicated by the dashed line, species B by a solid line, and species C are the dots. Let's read the question together. According to fossil records and recent published observations, 2 species of leaf-eating beetles, species A and B, have existed on an isolated island in the Pacific Ocean for over 100 years. 100,000 years. In 1964, a third species of leaf-eating beetle, species C, was accidentally introduced on the island. The population size of each species has been regularly monitored as shown in the graph above. So here is your question, and look at your task verbs. Describe the effect of the introduction of beetle species C has had on the population density of species A and B. So you want to describe the effect that introducing species C has on both A and B, and then propose an explanation for the patterns of population density that you observe in species A and B. So take a look at the graph and see what's happening. Okay, so as species C gets introduced, what happens to species A? Doesn't really change much, right? Species B, we can see that there is a decline in that line. All right, so let's take a look at the scoring guidelines for this, because we're going to describe that and propose an explanation. So first of all, species C had little effect on species A because its graph didn't change. However, as species C increases, B decreases. And in order to have been awarded that point, both of the lines for species A and for species B needed to be addressed. An explanation for species A, or that dashed line, there was little or no competition from species C when it came onto the island. Another way to say that is there's no niche overlap. For B, B declined, so there must have been competition or niche overlap. All right, so I hope that makes sense for a type of FRQ you could get. So here's one more, practice with disruptions to ecosystems, a little bit more about human impact. As part of a new suburban development, a sports complex consisting of athletic fields and buildings is constructed in a formerly wooded area. Predict one ecological consequence on the local plant community that is likely to result during the site preparation and construction of the sports complex, and then justify that prediction. So we're talking about a consequence to the plant community and then justifying that. So 2 points for this, and if you see the prediction needed to be linked to the justification. So if you predicted that there would be plant death or loss of plant biomass, you'd have to justify that because trees or shrubs were removed. There could have been pollution that affected the growth of those plants. There may have been some plants removed that created fewer individuals available for reproduction. And then the habitat being altered could change the amount of sunlight or isolate populations. You could have said that there were reduced numbers of plant species, that there was a loss of biodiversity, again, because of the removal of trees or shrubs or reduced habitat or pollution. Decreased genetic diversity, the population size is reduced. We talked about population bottlenecks in an earlier lesson. Habitat loss, removal of trees and shrubs, or soil loss due to the lack of ground cover. Increased success of sun-tolerant plants because shading trees were removed, or the introduction or immigration of new plant species because the new habitat was created, and now we're introducing landscaped environments. So let's debrief. You should now be able to explain how interactions within and among populations influence community structure and describe the structure of a community according to its species composition and diversity. You should be able to explain how community structure is related to energy availability in the environment. You should be able to explain the interaction between the environment and random or persisting variations in populations. Explain how invasive species affect ecosystem dynamics. Describe human activities that lead to changes in an ecosystem. Explain how both geological and meteorological activity leads to changes in the ecosystem structure and/or dynamics, and perform mathematical calculations. In this case, it was Simpsons diversity index. And again, your key takeaways: evolution is characterized by a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time and is supported by multiple lines of evidence. Communities and ecosystems change on the basis of interactions among populations and disruptions to the environment. So one thing I want to point out is some common errors and misunderstandings. This was a question on this topic from last year's exam. You can look at the graph. Figure 1 shows the probability of nest success in an environment with predators. It shows warblers only and warblers and cuckoos, and then it's got a probability of nest success as the dependent variable on the y-axis. There's a lot of background information, and I'm going to read it to you, but I'd like you to read along with me. And then you can see the question that they're asking is really straightforward. This was a short FRQ. So the task verb is to describe, and maybe I'll read you the question before we go into all the details so you can see where we're going. You want to describe the symbiotic relationship that exists between the cuckoo and the warbler in an environment without predators. All right, so let's read the background information on this question. Some birds, including great spotted cuckoos, lay their eggs in the nest of other birds, such as reed warblers. The warbler parents raise the unrelated chicks and provide them with food that would otherwise be given to their biological offspring. A researcher conducted an investigation to determine the type of relationship between the warblers and cuckoos in an environment without predators. The researcher found that the nests containing only the warblers were more likely to be successful than nests containing warblers and cuckoos. That is not the data that's shown. Remember, the data that's shown is with predators. A successful nest is defined as a nest where at least one chick becomes an adult warbler. In some geographical areas, several species of nest predators were present. Researchers have found that cuckoo chicks, while in the nest, produce a smelly substance that deters nest predators. The substance does not remain in the nest if the cuckoo chicks are removed. Figure 1 shows the probability that nests containing only warblers or containing both warblers or cuckoos will be successful in an environment with predators. In a follow-up experiment, the researchers added cuckoos to a nest that contained only warblers, which was group 1, and removed cuckoos from a nest containing warblers and cuckoos, which is group 2. So that is the data that is presented. Again, describe the relationship, the symbiotic relationship that exists between the cuckoo and the warbler in an environment without predators. So the description is that the cuckoos are parasites of the warbler. Another way to say that is that the cuckoo benefits from the relationship and the warbler is harmed by the relationship. So what was the common student misconception or gap in knowledge that was seen when this response was graded by the reader? So this was like a global, what did students miss? And if you look to the left, some responses confused competition with symbiotic association. So you need to know the difference between competition and the different types of symbiotic relationships. Some student responses confused predation with parasitism. They are different, so make sure you know the difference between those. Responses that identified the relationship only by the shorthand as plus or minus were not detailed enough to indicate understanding of the relationship. So the question asked for description, and the species needed to be identified based on their role in the relationship by saying something like the cuckoos benefit and the warblers were harmed. So this is something to keep in mind. The readers can only score you on what you write, not what we think you mean. So we know you understand the situation is that one benefits and one is being harmed, but we don't know if you understand the specific type of interaction. So a response that demonstrated understanding would be something like, the symbiotic relationship is parasitic because the cuckoos take the food from the warblers and lower the success rate of the nest overall when there are no predators. So that's just way more information about your understanding than just putting the relationship as plus minus. I hope that makes sense. All right, finally, your homework, AP exam practice. All right, so this is practice for tomorrow, and I'll be with you again tomorrow, so I'll be debriefing this at the beginning of the lesson. You are given a situation where you have invasive species. In this case, they're red fire ants. They're introduced into an ecosystem that often threaten native plants and animals. You are asked to describe 3 different factors that contribute to the success of an invasive species in an ecosystem. Hopefully, this lesson gives you the background to answer this question. So this should be a short and sweet warm-up tomorrow. I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us for all of our lessons. I'll be here with you tomorrow, so be sure to complete that practice question, and we will review it as our warm-up tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.